Harry and Meghan Markle's surrogacy scandal has entered the mainstream media domain.
Did you think it was a parody? Because I thought that this was AI. I thought this cannot be real.
The reason I didn't think it was AI is because it looks like the stomach is fake, where the baby, I swear that's the first thing I thought.
The thing about this story is that it doesn't start with a lie. It starts with confusion. And confusion, when repeated enough times, begins to feel deliberate. Because pregnancy, one of the most universal human experiences, somehow became, in her hands, a cinematic saga with rewrites, retakes, and emotional rebranding. According to public narrative, the Duchess of Drama has managed to make one of the most natural experiences in life, pregnancy, sound like a Netflix anthology. And that line alone tells you everything. Pregnancy as a series, not a moment, not a chapter, a full-blown episodic release. Different moods, different tones, different emotional arcs, all starring the same woman, all claiming to be the same truth. One day it's glowing serenity. The next day it's emotional devastation. And somewhere in between, the audience is left blinking, wondering when the script changed.
This is from a woman who attacks her father mercilessly in the series.
According to public narrative, the Duchess of Drama has managed to make one of the most natural experiences in life, pregnancy, sound like a Netflix anthology.
Meghan at the Albert Hall. How many weeks pregnant was she supposed to be? Was it about 8 weeks? And she looks as if she's at least 5 months pregnant.
One episode, it's all glowing motherhood and avocado toast. The next, it's a near tragic ordeal that no one could ever understand. Even her biggest supporters whisper that the story keeps changing faster than the British weather. And that whisper, that's the key. Because this isn't coming from hardened critics alone. This is coming from people who wanted to believe her, people who defended her, the people who clapped, nodded, empathized until even they started noticing the emotional weather pattern changing without warning. Sunny 1 minute, storm warnings the next.
Markle told the world she was a fraud. Perhaps we should have all listened.
Sources close to royal watchers joke that tracking Meghan's pregnancy timeline requires a PhD in plot twists. That joke isn't actually funny anymore because timelines matter, especially royal ones. Especially when every appearance, every interview, every public sighting is documented, time-stamped, photographed, archived. And right there, quietly standing in the background, not yelling, not accusing, not slamming fists on tables, is Tom Bauer. The man who doesn't need to shout because he understands something far more dangerous. Silence is sharper than outrage. He doesn't call her a liar. He doesn't say the word. He does something far more unsettling. He documents. He lines things up. He lets the gaps breathe. And then he steps back. And that ridiculous story about how they first met. The whole thing was a tissue of inaccuracy to be polite, yet somehow leaves the audience clutching their teacups in disbelief. That's his method. Polite disbelief. A raised eyebrow instead of a pointed finger. Because when you're dealing with someone whose stories shapeshift, the most effective weapon isn't accusation, it's comparison.
And also, why is the belly several shades browner than anywhere else? It's not supposed to be brown.
But what he uncovered next made even the palace whisper. Wait, that doesn't add up. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Designer dresses hugging a perfectly placed bump. Soft lighting, gentle smiles, the visual language of modern royal motherhood. But listen closely, because the story underneath that image kept mutating. What started as cheerful anecdotes about cravings and kicks slowly morphed into something heavier, darker, more emotionally loaded. And every time it was retold, it felt just slightly adjusted. Public observers noticed that her tone seemed to shift with each new platform. On one show, she was playful, joking about late-night cravings. On another, she described emotional turmoil and fear. Then came the podcast episode where she spoke about trauma that allegedly changed her forever. That's when people stopped hearing a story and started hearing versions. Multiple emotional costumes worn over the same event. And that's where Bauer's quiet alarm bells start ringing. Because evolution is natural. Reinvention is strategic. And when storytelling adapts perfectly to the audience every single time, that's not memory, that's performance. Then came the moment that made people sit up straighter in their chairs. The casual confidence, the throwaway lines, the physical claims that didn't quite sit right with women who had actually lived it. They were like, I just saw this picture I'd forgotten about when you were so pregnant with Archie. I mean, I gained 65 lbs with both pregnancies. Oh my God, you're so tiny. And you're in these 5, and I always just wear my 5 and point pointy-toed stilettos, high heels, tiny ankles, massive bump, all weight carried perfectly forward, no swelling elsewhere, no physical limitation, no imbalance except the kind that makes experienced mothers exchange looks instead of words. And that's when the questions stop being petty and start becoming anatomical. Because pregnancy isn't just visual, it's biological. It leaves traces. It demands concessions. It limits movement. And yet, here was a story that defied the lived reality of countless women watching. Like people, how on earth? How on earth am I not just tipping, face planting? Exactly. How on earth? And once that question is asked out loud, it doesn't go away. Then come the timelines, the dates, the overlaps, the moments that refuse to align no matter how gently you try to make them. Interviews describing early pregnancy feelings after the child was already born, nesting stories that don't fit the calendar, emotional recollections that land in the wrong year, and Bauer doesn't correct the dates. He just places them next to each other. It's actually torture to listen to that woman now because every other word out of her mouth is a lie. That reaction didn't come from nowhere. It came from exhaustion, from trying to reconcile too many versions of the same event. And then the medical stories arrive, and that's when even neutral observers lean forward. Calm delivery stories, jokes, laughter, leaving the hospital quickly. Then later, danger, trauma, emergency framing. There is no way on earth that any doctor on this earth would allow a woman with a geriatric pregnancy, high risk, and with 2 epidurals to leave the hospital within an hour of giving birth. That's not gossip. That's logic. And logic is where narratives begin to fracture. Bauer doesn't say it's impossible. He lets doctors, mothers, and common sense say it for him. And then, just when facts blur, emotion takes over completely. The glow disappears. The vulnerability intensifies. The story becomes heavier, sadder, more fragile. Skin, when it stretches, gets lighter. It doesn't get darker. Details like that don't scream. They whisper. And whispers linger longer. By the time she's retelling the story again, it's no longer about pregnancy at all. It's about identity, victimhood, reinvention. Each version invites a different reaction: admiration, sympathy, defense, outrage. And that's when it becomes clear this isn't inconsistency by accident. This is narrative control by instinct. Tom Bauer never accuses her of lying. He exposes something far more unsettling: a pattern, a method, a cycle where emotion replaces evidence and storytelling becomes armor. And that's where I'll stop this part, because the next section is where silence becomes louder than words and the real danger of selective storytelling fully reveals itself. And here's where the story turns colder. Not louder, not messier, just quieter. Because once the emotions have been spent, once the versions have multiplied, what remains isn't outrage. It's absence, silence, gaps so clean they almost feel intentional. That's the part that unsettles people the most. For every interview overflowing with feeling, there's another moment where the most basic details are simply skipped. Dates softened, locations blurred, medical logistics waved away with a smile and a metaphor. And when those omissions pile up, they start to feel heavier than any dramatic confession ever could. People noticed how certain questions were never answered twice the same way, how follow-ups were gently redirected, how anecdotes replaced specifics. And the more she spoke, the more selective the storytelling became. Not defensive, not evasive, curated. That's where the fascination locks in. Because silence isn't empty. Silence is shaped. And in royal narratives especially, silence is rarely accidental. Observers began to realize that the missing pieces weren't random. They were consistent. Certain moments always stayed vague. Certain transitions were always skipped. Certain explanations were always emotional instead of factual. And that pattern started ringing louder than any accusation. It's the reason people didn't just move on. They leaned closer. They replayed clips. They compared interviews. They noticed how one platform brought lightness, another brought gravity, another brought trauma. Each version calibrated perfectly to its audience. And the more that happened, the less this felt like memory and the more it felt like narrative engineering. There's a reason seasoned biographers don't accuse. Accusations end conversations. Patterns start them. By laying out contradictions without commentary, the effect becomes almost psychological. Readers feel clever. Viewers feel perceptive. They don't feel told what to think. They feel like they they figured it out themselves. And that's far more powerful. That's when the discussion moved away from pregnancy entirely, because the pregnancy was never the core issue. The core issue was control. Control over framing, control over emotion, control over timing, control over how much is revealed and when. The ability to remix the same event endlessly, each time extracting a different emotional reaction from the audience. Sympathy during backlash, strength during criticism, vulnerability during rebrand. Every version useful, none final. And once people see that pattern, they can't unsee it. That's why the internet didn't settle this story. It amplified it. Clips were dissected, screenshots archived, quotes compared across years. Not because everyone wanted a scandal, but because humans are wired to resolve inconsistency. And this one refused to resolve. Each unanswered question became engagement fuel. Each silence became speculation. Each retelling became another branch in an ever-growing tree of doubt. And the most ironic part, the more carefully the narrative was managed, the less believable it became. Because authenticity doesn't require this much adjustment. At some point, even neutral viewers stopped asking what happened and started asking, why does this keep changing? That's when the story stopped belonging to its subject and started belonging to the audience. Podcasts, YouTube breakdowns, comment threads longer than the interviews themselves. People weren't chasing truth anymore, they were chasing coherence. Something solid. Something that didn't shift depending on lighting and platform. But coherence never came. Instead, the story kept evolving. Not forward, sideways. And that's where the final realization settles in. This was never about proving something false. It was about watching something refuse to stay still. A narrative that adapts instead of concludes. An experience that multiplies instead of clarifies. A silence that speaks louder every time it returns. Because in the digital age, mysteries don't need answers to survive. They just need momentum. And this one has plenty. Every new interview reopens old questions. Every pause restarts the conversation. Every selective detail becomes a mirror for projection. And that's the lasting impact of this saga. Not exposure, not collapse, but endless curiosity. A story that never ends, only reshapes itself. And as long as it keeps reshaping, people will keep watching. Not because they hate her, not because they believe everything, but because something about it doesn't sit right. And once that feeling takes hold, no amount of emotion can silence it. And that's where everything finally lands. Not with a bang, not with a confession, but with exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from chasing a story that refuses to sit still. People stopped asking for proof and started asking for peace. But peace never came, because the narrative never chose a final form. What lingered wasn't outrage anymore. It was discomfort. The sense that something deeply personal had been turned into a reusable asset. That motherhood, memory, and emotion were edited like footage, trimmed, reshaped, and redeployed whenever the moment demanded it. And here's the truth people don't like admitting out loud. The story worked. It kept attention. It kept relevance. It kept the spotlight warm even when credibility cooled. That's why it didn't need closure. Closure would have ended the cycle. Instead, ambiguity became the engine. Silence became strategy. Emotion became insulation. And the audience, they became unwilling participants, forever debating versions instead of facts. That's the final twist. Not whether something happened or didn't, but how easily truth can dissolve when storytelling becomes more important than consistency. Because once a story learns it can survive without settling, it never stops changing. And that's why this saga doesn't fade, it just waits for the next retelling, for the next retelling, for the next retelling, for the next